Welcome. We're so glad you're here with us for today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series began in 1979 with Hannah Holborn Gray speaking in San Francisco. As the need for critical thought remains apparent in all areas of life, we proudly continue this signature program to bring you stimulating conversations and fresh ideas. Thank you once more for joining us. We couldn't do this without you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jan Perino, and I received my Master's of Liberal Arts from the University of Chicago, and I currently serve as a member of the Alumni Board, and I'm honored to do so. Today, we get to celebrate this UChicago community and continue our tradition of relentless pursuit of knowledge, critical thought, and focusing on the life of the mind. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you to tonight's Harper Lecture, which is After Colonialism, 100 Years of Self-Determination with Professor Adom Getachew. This evening, we are truly delighted to have Professor Getachew with us, and let me tell you why. She is a Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science, Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, and the College at the University of Chicago. Professor Getachew is a political theorist with research interests in the history of political thought, theories of race and empire, and post-colonial political theory. Her work focuses on the intellectual and political histories of Africa and the Caribbean. She is the author of Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise of Self-Determination, which was published in 2019, and co-editor with Jennifer Pitts of W.E.B. Du Bois International Writings, published in 2022. Adom holds a joint PhD in political science and African American Studies from Yale University. She is on the faculty board of the Posen Center for Human Rights, a fellow at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. So as you can see, she is eminently qualified to talk about our subject tonight. So I want to remind you that you can just add any questions into the Q&A feature on your screen, and then we will get to as many of those questions as possible. So for now, please join me in welcoming Professor Adom Getachew to our virtual stage.
Great. Good evening, everybody, or good morning for some of you, afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and I just want to thank Jan for that warm introduction. I want to thank Andrea and Adam and everyone else who's backstage making this virtual talk possible, and thank all of you for taking some time to listen to some of my research. This talk is based on my 2019 book, which was called Worldmaking After Empire, which examined the history of decolonization and self-determination with a particular focus on Anglophone Africa and the Caribbean. And I'll be broadly talking through this question of what self-determination has meant and what it entailed in this broad century of decolonization. So to just set the stage, I thought we might start by looking at this map of the world from 1914. So just as World War I is about to get started. And you see at the dawn of the 20th century, most of the world, and especially the parts of the world I examine, Africa and the Caribbean, are controlled by a European power. So the process of decolonization happens in fits and starts across this period. Of course, you can see the Americas, South America, the United States would have already gained independence by 1914. That process happened in 1776 in the US, and then through the 19th century across Latin America. After World War I, so right after this map, there's a kind of the first real collapse of empires, world empires, and this would really be the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, so Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and North Africa, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the moment I really study, it happens after World War II, and this is the really large wave of decolonization that happens in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And this turns out to be quite fast-paced. Most of it happens between 1945 and the mid-1960s, although there's a few states that haven't yet decolonized by the 1970s and 80s. It really upends expectations. So at the end of World War II, even after India gains independence in 1947, there's a sense among kind of British imperial powers, British imperial actors, administrators, that decolonization in Africa at least would continue for 100 more years. So, but by just in 1 year, in 1960, 17 African states would gain independence. So what's really striking about that phase of decolonization, as I'll try to argue tonight, is that it's really articulated through the idiom and through the language of self-determination, which makes it quite distinct from those earlier periods. So in today's talk, I'll get through, hopefully, this kind of long history and this transformation of the way self-determination becomes central. So I'll say a little bit about what many take to be kind of the origins of self-determination in the ideas of Woodrow Wilson and Lenin. I'll talk a little bit about decolonization in the interwar period, focusing again on the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. I'll then say something about what my own work is about around the kind of reinvention and universalization of self-determination, which, as I said, happens after World War II. We'll think both about the various dimensions of what self-determination meant in that context and the limits of that political project. And then we'll think about contemporary legacies in the present. So in various ways, decolonization, self-determination, the idea of self-determination, in fact, is a concept we might trace actually to the Enlightenment period. So some of you who were in the college at the University of Chicago, in your core classes, you would have read figures like Kant and Marx and others. And so that's a period where there is already an argument or a claim of self-determination, but it's largely couched through and around the individual. It's about the self-determining person. And gradually, especially in the wake of the French Revolution, there's some sense that the self-determining person has to be situated and understood in a kind of collective self-determining public or polity. And so it becomes tied to democracy. These arguments about autonomy and self-rule continue into the late 19th century, but it would really be in the moment of World War I that this idea comes to the fore, comes to be a kind of international principle, especially associated with collective self-rule. Now, it's normally the idea of self-determination is associated with Woodrow Wilson's liberal internationalism as the architect of the League of Nations. But one of the surprising things about Wilson actually is that he used the term self-determination very rarely, maybe once or twice in his writings and speeches during the war. He tended to use an older concept from his own writings called, which was consent of the governed. And he thought in various ways that the idea of self-determination was actually a very dangerous concept, right? Because how would we know which peoples were the appropriate agents? Who was the self of self-determination? How would you kind of decide what polities would have this, would be guaranteed the capacity to be self-determining? So I can say more about the other kind of reasons he was sort of a critic, actually, in various ways of self-determination. But part of the reason he begins to mobilize the concept is because Lenin, and then remember, this is also the period of the Russian Revolution. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks are beginning to mobilize and deploy the language of self-determination. So self-determination is much more present in Lenin's writings of this period, and he's picking up on a kind of long socialist tradition of thinking about what the relationship between nationalism and socialism should be. He makes an argument early in his writings that self-determination means the right to exist as a separate state. And this argument for Lenin is both a response to the multinational character of the Russian Empire, that it's composed of many peoples and nationalities, but it's also articulating an argument that socialists should be intervening and shaping democratic struggles that are happening in colonized countries across the world. So one of the things that's really striking about the period around 1914 to 1919 is that these debates about what self-determination means are coming to the fore, but in fact, they never get institutionalized in the major documents that end the war. So the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations Covenant that founds the first major international organization of the 20th century. Neither of these documents have any kind of claim about self-determination, but this concept is being it's being picked up by nationalist movements across the world in places like Egypt, in India, and various kind of anti-colonial actors are beginning to pick up this language of self-determination and think about what it might mean for their own moment. Also, I think another just thing to note is that by this moment, basically by the period of World War I, the concept of self-determination is really imagined as a collective right or a collective principle rather than something that's associated with the individual. So I think another kind of really important concept or that emerges out of this post World War I period is decolonization. So the term decolonization actually is initially coined in French in the 1830s. This is the period when France has just colonized Algeria, and it emerges in a context in which a kind of architects of that colonial project are thinking about what might be the future of colonization, French colonization of Algeria. And this is the way in which that concept of decolonization comes up. It's very, it ends up being, it appears a few other times in the 19th century, but it's really popularized after World War I. So an intellectual historian, Stuart Ward, has traced the kind of origins of this concept to a German thinker, a German emigre thinker, Moritz Bonn, who is an economist living in the United Kingdom. And after the war, Germany has lost its colonies. So he's trying to think about how to understand this loss of Germany's colonies. And so he comes up with a kind of an account in which decolonization is the kind of ultimate kind of end point of colonization. That so he articulates an argument that colonial empires are all going to come to an end, and that the German people should, as a result, find a new vocation of rallying countries on the international stage who don't have colonies and who are threatened by kind of larger European empires like Britain or France. So then his articulation of decolonization as a kind of a natural process, a natural culmination of colonization, gets picked up by French and British thinkers in the 30s and 40s. What's really striking about this kind of conception of decolonization is that basically it makes decolonization a triumph of empire, a culmination of empire, rather than its defeat. And we'll talk about how that contrasts with the kind of project of decolonization as it unfolds in the 1950s and 60s. So there's this kind of depoliticization and naturalization of decolonization in this initial articulation. Now, so for Africa, for the Caribbean, for Asia, the period after World War I is really a disappointment, right? There's a kind of initial articulation of a kind of language of self-determination, but no actual process or there's no direction towards independence, right? But as I said, this period is really important because there is the fall of these two very consequential empires, the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the space of the Balkans, of Central and Eastern Europe, are the kind of, you can say, the early sites of experimentation with the politics of decolonization. So this is the space in which new nation states are created. And the nation state really gets imagined and conceived as the kind of counterpoint or antidote to empire. There's the kind of consolidation of national sovereignty out of imperial structures where sovereignty was never thought of as unitary and singular. So, and the nation state really becomes a kind of way of thinking about that. I've put on this slide some recent work in these areas, just if you're interested in summer reading or interested in following up on any of these ideas. So the other thing that emerges out of this period is a kind of expansion of what international governance means. So the League of Nations creates a mandate system, and the mandates were territories primarily that were governed by Germany and the Ottoman Empire, where those territories don't get independence, but they're kind of managed by other imperial powers and through the mandate system. So there's this sense of international governance of territories and of peoples, and a growing kind of infrastructure of international economic coordination and economic intervention in sovereign states. So on the one hand, we have the kind of rise of the nation state and a kind of consolidation of a concept and practice of national sovereignty. At the same time, and really in the same process of decolonization, we have this kind of rise of international economic and political governance. And the relationship between these two, between national independence and international governance, will be a central kind of question throughout the 20th century, and we might say even in our present moment. Okay, so if decolonization wasn't happening in the Caribbean and in Africa, what was happening during this interwar period? So part of what I do in my work is really track the kind of networks of Black intellectuals and in the Caribbean and Africa and their African American interlocutors through this period. So the interwar period is a moment of intense political and intellectual collaboration. There's travel, people are meeting at conferences, at convenings in the US, in European metropoles. They're organizing journals and newspapers, such as this one that, this is from 1938, the International African Opinion, which is published out of the UK, but circulates quite widely across the Atlantic world. And they're also meeting each other at institutions of higher education. And here I particularly want to highlight the role of historically Black colleges and universities like Lincoln University and Howard University, because those universities would be places that African students, Caribbean students would be able to have an education, and then they would get to know and participate in Black political circles and networks. And this space was a really important kind of arena for the exchange of ideas and for future kind of the development of future political solidarities. And I'm happy to say more about that in Q&A. So the characters I really work on in the book, in the first book, Worldmaking After Empire, really span the Caribbean and Africa. I've listed some of the figures here: Kwame Nkrumah, Eric Williams, Michael Manley, Julius Nyerere. And what really distinguishes these four and some of the other figures in the book is that they were both intellectuals. Eric Williams, for instance, was a university professor before becoming a politician, and so they wrote a lot about like what their political project was. But they were also all political actors. All four of these figures, in particular, ended up being statesmen, prime ministers, and presidents of their respective countries. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is give you a sense of what is the critique of empire that's emerging from this kind of Black Atlantic set of networks, political and intellectual networks, and then how do they begin to redefine what self-determination means in light of that critique? Okay, so I think for many of us, there's a kind of an accepted, a sort of way in which we understand what the problem of empire was. And this is a kind of what I call a kind of the standard account of the problem of empire. And really this is focused on what in the kind of international relations literature is called alien rule. Alien rule meaning a foreign country ruling another country, without without consent. So that Britain, for instance, ruled Ghana or Jamaica would be the kind of classic example. And that structure of alien rule also would then mean that Ghana or Jamaica did not have status within international society, right? They were not sovereign actors, so they had no position. They were excluded from the rights of membership in international society. So the Black Atlantic account of empire, I think really, it's not that they're not interested in the problem of alien rule, but they situate the problem of alien rule in a wider kind of international context. So they think, for instance, that really empire is structured by a kind of not exclusion, but unequal integration. That what really distinguishes colony and metropole is that the legal, political, and economic standing of the colony is kind of always in a hierarchical relationship with the metropole. What's important about this imagination of a kind of hierarchical world order is that it allows them to think about places that are independent, nominally independent, like Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia, which are all independent states in this period, but are subject to various forms of political and economic subordination. So they have a kind of flexible account of what imperialism is. Second, they make an argument that this kind of structure of international hierarchy is really a racial hierarchy. It's structured by what W.E.B. Du Bois, the really important African-American intellectual of the 20th century, would call the color line. The problem of the 20th century, he argued, is the problem of a kind of international color line. And for them, that history or that kind of racialized world order really stems from the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So they kind of have a longue durée view about how the world came to be integrated on unequal terms on the basis of enslaved Black labor and then later racialized colonial labor, and that this structure has produced a world bifurcated by race and unequally integrated such that it produces domination on the world stage. So what's important about this critique is that really, if you follow it, it unfolds in concentric circles. They have an account of at the level of the individual, at the level of the collective, what would become the nation, and also at the level of the international order. So thinking about the level of the individual, what they're imagining is a situation in the colonies where the kind of colonial subject is deprived of civil, political, and economic rights, and is is subject to both exploitation, economic exploitation, and arbitrary power. So just to just make this like maybe a little bit more concrete for people, for many of the African colonies, the primary kind of agent of the colonial state that one might interact with was the figure of the district officer, who was the kind of local agent. And this figure, had the kind of capacity. There is no kind of separation of powers, right? So this person makes the laws, executes the laws, judges the laws. So this concentration of power in one particular figure means that, you never have recourse to a kind of a different body, right? You can never appeal to a different body. And so that relationship for them was one of arbitrary power. Another kind of feature they discuss is, even though this is the 20th century and slavery has been abolished in the colonies, there is for them basically a de facto structure of forced labor, which they would argue was tantamount to a form of slavery. So there's various practices of coercion through which people are compelled to labor on plantations or on public works programs for the colonial state. So if that's the kind of like story at the individual level, at the collective level, they're thinking about the denial of self-rule, right? That a majority of the world's population at that particular moment is denied the capacity for ruling themselves, and that this denial is really a kind of racial one. And then finally, at the international level, that this structure of individual and collective domination within the colony is organized internationally through, again, that structure of unequal integration. So this particular critique, produces an account of self-determination that tries to respond at each level. And in my book, I argue that what the account of self-determination that comes to be prominent in the after World War II is an account of self-determination that marries nation building and world making, and I'll get to world making in a second. So at the level of like at the kind of in the terms of nation building, what many of these political actors insist on is three things. One, an argument of universal citizenship, so the de-racialization of civil and political rights, and often many of them argued for no kinds of multicultural rights, or rights that recognized ethnic or religious difference within these territories. And I'll get to that as one of the limits of this project in a second. The second thing they are argued for is that democratic self-government or democracy is the only legitimate form of government, right? So they really make their case for self-determination through a democratic argument. And I would argue, and others have argued too, that actually this moment of decolonization in the 20th century is the first moment when popular sovereignty is universalized. So it kind of completes, one might say, or realizes the kind of universal aspirations that fomented the French Revolution. And I think that's very important because I'll say a bit about this. Of course, many of these societies end up becoming authoritarian regimes. But I think it's such an important thing that this is the first time in the history of the modern world in which empire or foreign rule is delegitimized. It gives us a kind of language for saying morally and ethically why it is wrong for people to not govern themselves. So the final and third piece of this kind of nation building project is really thinking about economic reconstruction and development. So here, what here, the nationalists I look at make a really important intervention, which is that if the colonial state had argued that African people were unable to govern themselves because they had not yet reached a certain kind of level of political and economic development, what these nationalists argue is that it is in fact, independence has to precede development. It's only when there is some form of self-government that there can be meaningful economic development. So if that's the kind of nation building part of the project, the world making part really focuses on reforming and transforming international institutions and international law. So the main thing, the really main way that self-determination becomes a central language of international law and international institutions is through a set of claims made by newly independent states as they enter the UN, that self-determination isn't merely a principle, but it's a universal right to which all people are entitled. So there's two important documents on this. One is the 1960 Resolution 1514, which is called the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. And this articulates an argument that all peoples have a right to self-determination, and an argument that all other human rights, individual human rights, depend on the realization of a collective right to self-determination. Self-determination also gets included in the human rights covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which are passed in 1966. And both of those covenants have, in Article 1, have the same language on a universal right to self-determination. The second piece of the kind of project of world making is really an attempt to create political federations, regional federations in the Caribbean and in Africa. The reason for this is that many of these nationalists feel that their states are too small and that they're never going to overcome the kind of economic inequality and political inequality that they face as small states. So both Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Eric Williams in Trinidad make an argument for creating larger blocks, larger units of states through federation. And they very explicitly are actually drawing on the American Federalists to make this argument for why kind of federal union can be a way of strengthening and bolstering their independence. So there's a West Indies Federation of 10 Anglophone states that is briefly realized from 1958 to 1962. In the African context, there's various attempts at union, and importantly, the Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union. And there's these debates about a kind of United States of Africa beginning in the late 50s and into the mid 60s, but that project is never realized in the same way as it is, as it would be in the West Indies. And then finally, in the 1970s, there's a really ambitious project called the New International Economic Order, which is an attempt to equalize trade relationships and trade relationships between global South and global North countries. And this is a wider third world or Afro-Asian project in which African states, Latin American states, and Asian states collaborate to make a set of demands on a more egalitarian global economy. So I think in some ways, one of the reasons I think it's worth thinking about self-determination as having both a domestic phase and an international phase, as being both about nation building and about being being about world making, is that it helps us try to think about that problem I posed earlier. So I said, after World War I, there was both this push for national independence and increasing international governance. And this combination of nation building and world making is a kind of response to how you could have some forms of independence, national independence, but also participate in and strengthen international governance and international institutions. So those two things did not need to be opposed, basically. Okay, so I just want to say a few things now about some of the limits of this project, and we can certainly talk more about it in Q&A. But I think, you know, I've already hinted at this, but, you know, if the kind of claim of universal citizenship was to overcome racial equality, you know, there's always this question about how do you think about really important forms of difference, ethnic, religious identities? Should they be recognized? What kind of recognition are they due within these very plural, multiracial, multicultural societies that many post-colonial states were? This question about how to recognize and deal with cultural, religious, ethnic difference is connected to the second point, which is, you know, should the post-colonial states be centralized unitary states, or should they be decentralized federations that allow for autonomy within various countries? So the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana, for instance, wanted a decentralized federation so that they could retain some autonomy within an independent Ghanaian state. The Katanga secession in the Congo, attempted secession in the Congo, was fueled by a similar desire for more local forms of autonomy within the newly formed Congolese state. And then, most importantly, these debates, they're not just debates and ideas. Of course, they led to, you know, profound forms of political violence, and this would be the case in Biafra, in Nigeria, where the failure to kind of redress forms of exclusion and ethnic violence led to the Biafran War of Independence, or the Nigerian Civil War. And then finally, you know, this question about how you think about the relationship between self-rule, democratic self-rule, and economic development would be another source of major contestation, right? So, and I'll give a very concrete example of this. So in Ghana, for instance, there was this effort to develop the Tema ports, right? So this was a major part of the kind of wider vision of modernizing the Ghanaian economy. But this kind of vision, you know, depended on ceding land, local community ceding land that was sacred to them, right? That had been an important part of their vision of who they were as a people. And so there's a way in which the kind of democratic aspirations and the modernist and modernizing ambitions of the project were never fully squared away. I just want to briefly stop here and mention this photo, which you're seeing, which is a Ghanaian photographer, James Barner. And this is a photo of a rally of the National Liberation Movement, which was the Ashanti Party demanding autonomy for Ashanti. And I plug this photo because if you're in Chicago or coming to campus in the coming weeks, there's a really amazing exhibition at the Smart Museum called Not All Realisms, which is a kind of exploration of photography in the 1960s and in Ghana, Mali, and South Africa. So it's worth checking out. So I want to just close by pointing to some direction, some ways in which, you know, the kind of preoccupations of that period continue in our present. And, you know, I think one of the most important ways in which the debate about self-determination continues has really been the ways it's been taken up by indigenous politics across the Americas and really around the world. So in 2007, there was a UN declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. And more broadly, the ways that I think indigenous actors, political actors have thinking about the question of self-determination is really dissociating it from the nation state and from that vision of, singular or unitary sovereignty, and thinking about forms of autonomy, forms of self-rule that may not necessarily take the form of the state. And I think that's just a very important way to be thinking about how self-determination could be maybe dissociated with state forms that are exclusionary, centralized, limiting local forms of autonomy. And this is connected to another kind of recent development of people who are thinking, again, in this case, thinking about kind of religious and ethnic pluralism, and thinking about how forms of decentralization and devolution of power can better respond to demands for forms of local autonomy against, centralized state actors. Finally, I think, especially in the last few years, there's been a growing kind of interest in questions of international economic inequality, and new ways of thinking about debt cancellation, of reparations, as ways to respond to the persistent hierarchies that emerged out of decolonization and out of the history of empire and colonization. So I'll close by just saying that I think, the history of self-determination is a long one, a much longer one than I've given you in this few periods, but I think it's a really central one in some ways. I think the story of colonization and decolonization has really fundamentally shaped our world over the last century, but of course for longer as well. And self-determination, even if it's no longer the kind of, it's no longer at the center of the ways in which people imagine political or economic justice, it's a window into a really central kind of set of concerns about what's the relationship between the individual and the collective, what's the relationship between the national and the international, right? How do we think at these various levels about what kind of freedom or justice might require? So with that, I'll just close and thank you all very much for being so attentive, and look forward to your questions.
This has just been terrific, and obviously so much more to learn. But let's start with some of the questions that were pre-submitted on the registration when you all registered. So there's one here from Adom Getachew, and actually it's a three-part question. It starts with, what are your thoughts on decolonization in the former French colonies of Africa? That's number one. And then the second part is, do you think the process of decolonization in this part of the world is complete? And then third, finally, what is your take on the relations between France and its former colonies nowadays or today?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that excellent question. I think in some ways, so yeah, my work really focused on the Anglophone part of the story, but I think there's a very parallel story to be told out of the French African world. So there were lots of debates and discussions across the linguistic barrier. I briefly mentioned that there had been a union or attempt at collaboration between Ghana, an Anglophone state, and Guinea and Mali, Francophone states. And these were responses to, they were wrestling with the same question about political, how do you really make independence meaningful politically and economically? And there's similar kinds of discussions about federation in the French context too. So, I think the question about is the process of decolonization complete? I think, no, and it's not complete in the French African context, but it's not complete anywhere. If we really imagine that kind of ambitious vision of, democratic self-rule, political and economic equality on the international and local stage. And in the French case, many others have written about this, but there's very specific kind of dynamics that are really important to understanding the persistent forms of imperialism. So for many who don't know, French West Africa uses the currency CFA, which was historically pegged to the franc and now to the euro. And this creates a really constrains monetary and fiscal policy of French, West African states. And this has been a kind of subject of, popular music, but also critical economic and political history. And maybe I'll put one name in the chat for people who are interested, or I'll put it in the chat, I think, and maybe Andrea can send it to everyone else.
Great.
So this economist is Ndongo Sambasila from Senegal, and a very important writer on these questions.
Great, thank you. There's another one from John Gallaty, and he asked, does colonialism define a particular sort of historical experience or a generalized relationship between North-South countries or richer or poorer countries? And he follows up by saying, I asked because Ethiopia was the only African country that was never formally colonized.
Yeah, so it's true, exactly. So I think partly what I was saying about the standard account of imperialism and this kind of Black Atlantic account that I was elaborating, those are exactly the two different forms of arguments. Like, one is that it's a very historic and specific relationship between country A and country B, and if that relationship doesn't exist, then there's no colonialism or imperialism. And this wider argument that actually it's a kind of the way that international institutions and a global economy is structured in ways that constantly reproduce a hierarchical relationship of dependence and domination. So, for instance, if you read my book, you'll see that the first chapter actually focuses on Liberia and Ethiopia. Both of those were independent states. They were both members of the League of Nations, but Ethiopia ends up being invaded by and colonized by Italy in 1935, and Liberia is almost invaded by the United States in the same period. And it's about the ways in which they're kind of the production of unequal status within international society. So on this like wider vision, then you could think of it as a more general set of experiences.
Very good. We have another question here from Terry Fellertag, and it's, while the world changed from empires and colonies to nation states, the cultural and economic residue of imperialism remains embedded in the world. So please comment on why this is so.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So one thing you could say about one way that, say, the language of decolonization has remained so important in the contemporary moment actually is like at universities, right? Decolonize the university, decolonize the curriculum, decolonize the canon. We've all heard versions of those. And I think like even as we might find, some of the ways that students articulate those demands as, extreme or difficult to process, at least, I think they're onto something. They're onto an insight actually developed in this earlier moment, which is that the production of knowledge and cultures has been part of this process of producing a hierarchical world, right? So if we're really going to reimagine our world, we have to like transform the ways we think and write and read and understand culture. So I think that's a really important argument. And partly, one way you can explain a kind of cultural imperialism is that, the processes of production and distribution that shape the economy also shape the distribution and production of cultural goods, right? So there's a way that, say, American culture, like I didn't grow up in America, but I watched every American show there ever was, right? I do think some of that is beginning to change as media has become more democratized, So my family's from Ethiopia, and we can sit in our living rooms in America and watch, shows that are now made in Ethiopia through YouTube or whatever. And there's also ways in which other kinds of, not hegemonic, but certainly more powerful states, Turkey, India, Nigeria, like these have become kind of regional and global South kind of cultural, major cultural centers. So I think some of this has already begun to change.
Yeah, so interesting. And you can see it day in, day out. There's a question here that, for your opinion, how can we make self-determination synonymous with nation building? What do you think? And
I mean,
Carmen Colo.
Thanks for that. And I think, maybe I'll tie that in with a couple of the questions which are also in the chats. Mike Smith is asking about Puerto Rico. I think there was someone else who's Thomas Priest is asking about non-states, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa. And I think, one thing I would say is I think it's actually important that self-determination not simply be nation building or the creation of nation states. If that is what people in those places want, right, they should be given the right to do that, and through a plebiscite, through a referendum. But it's also important that, we think about autonomy and self-rule doesn't necessarily have to be the same as independence, right? And I think, for instance, someone had mentioned the French case earlier, and one really striking feature about some of the French intellectuals, French Francophone, African and Caribbean intellectuals of this period, is that they argued that they didn't want independence. So Martinique, for instance, is not independent, right? It wanted equality within French society, and partly because their argument was like, well, we made French society, right? It was our enslaved labor that produced the wealth and resources of France, and we want a kind of distributed equality within the French, French Federation or French Federation. So I think there's different ways to imagine what self-determination could mean, and I think that's true in Puerto Rico and Guam and other societies too. It could be that, I think it's true that for many folks, there's been waxing and waning periods of Puerto Rican nationalism. For instance, there were periods where kind of national independence was the aim of Puerto Ricans. I think increasingly now, statehood within the U.S. is a kind of vision of what and kind of at least the plurality of Puerto Ricans want. And here I would just suggest the work of Yarimar Bonilla, and I'll again put the name in the chat for folks. I don't know if you can see these, but she's an anthropologist, and she wrote a book called Non-Sovereign Futures about Guadeloupe, and she's now working on a book on Puerto Rico.
Great. Thank you for that. So this is changing tune a little bit to go back to the beginning of your presentation, and this question is about Lenin. How is the concept of self-determination as defined by Lenin, how does it differ from that of the American Declaration of Independence? What was he thinking versus American?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's a couple of things that are, it's not a radical departure. And in fact, for many advocates of decolonization in the 20th century, the American Declaration of Independence in 1776 is a really important reference point. So, for instance, Ho Chi Minh, who's leader of the Vietnam Revolution, was a reader, carried around, the American Declaration of Independence. So I think it's not that they're radically different, but I would say the main difference is that The Declaration of Independence, at least on my reading, is an argument about a particular kind of grievance that the 13 American colonies have with, with the king of Britain, the English king. And what's different about the 20th century debate, and what's different about Lenin's particular conception, is that one, it's not like we have specific grievances with, the way we're being ruled. It's that any form of foreign rule is, whether it's good foreign rule or bad for, it's just like, that's not, that's no longer a legitimate form of rule. That's one. Two, for the American colonies, the concept of the nation is not really that central. Like nationalism is a kind of product of the 19th century. And so when Lenin is talking about, when he imagines a people, what he's really imagining is communities that are in some way national communities by language, by culture, by a kind of collective history that they share. And so this way in which nationhood, nationness becomes the kind of basis of a claim for self-determination really distinguishes the kind of 20th century story from the American 18th century story.
Okay. Wow, so much. So we are coming on time, unfortunately, and we have one more question that is a little out of the box. A few of us would like to know what that picture that is behind you stands for.
Oh, great. So this is actually a photographer, Malian photographer. His name is Malik Sidibe. And if you come to the Smart Museum, you can see some of his work in the show.
Fantastic. It's quite the...
Yeah, I love her. I want to channel her energy
yes.
all the time when I'm in here.
It's great. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you very much, Professor Getachew. And thanks to all the questions. My gosh, we had some very insightful questions come through too. And we thank you for all of those. Just been a terrific evening. And lastly, just thank you all for coming together. This is truly a sharing of the life of the mind.